Mia had learned, in the months since Chief Williams's confession and the reading of his private instructions, to treat every quiet as if it might be a prelude. The mansion's chandeliers threw soft light over the same rooms that had once felt like shorelines, safe, familiar, but she moved through them now with the small, habitual checks of someone who had counted every lock twice. Samuel laughed from the corridor, his small footsteps like a bell. The sound steadied her the way sunlight steadied the dust. That laugh had become the measure against which she timed fear. If you haven't seen what led them here, there are moments you should not miss. Watch the earlier parts to see how the will split a fortune, how secrets were stitched into a dying man's last hours, and why Mia became the axis of a family torn between loyalty and avarice. If you want to follow the rescue and the full unmasking, subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next twist. The morning spread thin light over the drawing room. Chief Williams sat in an armchair that matched the dim in his eyes, an old shawl over his knees, though the Lago sun had already pushed at the curtains. He kept his voice small, the way a man keeps coins in a pocket he is afraid to open. Mia brought him a cup of tea, and stood a beat too long by the doorway, watching him close his fingers around the cup as if it were more than porcelain. If he could hold on to that cup, maybe he could hold on to what little dignity he had left. "Do you remember the mango tree?" he asked suddenly, surprising her by the suddenness of memory. "By the old house in Maitama. Your laugh used to scare the birds." Mia allowed herself a smile. "They were loud then as they are now, sir. Some things don't change." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh but sounded like surrender. "I am tired, Mia. I left things to you because I trusted the goodness I saw. I trusted you." She sat opposite him and placed Samuel's small drawing, scribbled houses with a stick figure sun, on the low table between them. The chairs around the table held the ghosts of arguments and the quiet of reconciliations. Outside, a car door banged softly. Footsteps on the pebbled drive marked this day like punctuation. Jonathan had called the night before, his voice flat but steady. Evidence would be moved tonight to a safe house in Abuja. The detectives came with him at dawn. He had said, simply, "We finish what he started." The mansion had become a theater for surveillance. Deborah and her circle had returned under shawls of mourning and speech rehearsed to soften any suspicion. Emma posted elegiac lines on her feed, each image filtered to honey tones. Kenneth's laughter leaked into a party video that last week, an attempt at normalcy, the sort of normalcy that pretends no will was read, no accusations whispered. Amelia had been quieter, a shadow that preferred to measure rather than speak. Olivia's downward arc made her unreliable enough to be useful and dangerous in equal measure. They moved through rooms with the ease of pedigree, like predators taught to hunt behind the velvet of polite life. Mia placed the kettle on for more tea. Samuel trailed a small wooden soldier along the rug. The soldier's painted face had a large nick where it had been dropped in anger months before. The nick was like a map of everything nearly lost. As she turned, a car slowed outside, and someone she did not recognize climbed the front steps. The maid at the back, a woman who had been with the house through seasons and scandals, looked at Mia with something like alarm in her eyes. "They asked for water for the old man," she whispered. "A man and a lady. They left a card, said they were from the clinic." Mia felt the air change. Visitors were not new, but every caller now was a calculus. She had learned, carefully, to ask names, to see badges, to cross-reference tones. Chief Williams's breathing had become a metronome. Not a lot of rhythm to trust, but enough to notice when it stuttered. The visitors, an elegant woman who smelled faintly of jasmine and a man with a polite smile, entered with a contrived sorrow. Deborah moved among them like a rehearsed wind, her hands perfectly placed over her chest, her eyes watering at the memory of the dead. Conversation drifted past the parlor like smoke. They had come bearing condolences and a reason to drink from a new bottle, one that glittered with promise. A special herbal infusion, the woman said, from a renowned naturopath in Lekki, to comfort the nerves. Mia took the glass for Chief Williams because the old man trusted Florentine manners and would not rebuff strangers. She thought of the water dispenser in the kitchen, the white cylinder by the service corridor, a mundane domestic object she had taken to filling each night for Samuel's water, for the plants, and for herself. It had become part of the house's quiet machinery, a vessel of life. Across the room, Emma's phone buzzed bright and loud. She glanced at a message and laughed, a noise too bright for the morning scene. The laughter hit a small chord of annoyance in Mia. It did not occur to her to suspect cruelty in something as simple as a glass. 2 hours later, the laughter stopped. It was Samuel who first coughed, a startled, wet sound. It pulled at Mia like a hook. One moment he was leaning on the sofa, the soldier dropped at his small feet. The next he clutched his chest, eyes wide, and then he swayed, his breath failing in a way that cleaned the air of trivial things. The room tightened and fell to hushed panic. Chief Williams was already small and pale. His face sank as if the floor beneath his aging heart had been taken out. There was chaos, people moving wrong, the maid running for the phone, a household of polished manners stripped to raw responses. Mia tried to lift Samuel and felt his body go limp against her. Her hands found the back of his neck and then the glass nearby. It had been full. The white dispenser loomed in the kitchen like a silent witness. Someone screamed for a doctor. Emma dialed furiously, her social self cracked and useless now. Deborah's face drained of color. Amelia's mouth set thin as if she had learned how to shape grief like a blade. A physician arrived from the clinic they had been told about, an on-call woman with tired eyes, Dr. Amina. She worked with practiced hands and an efficient breath. Her voice was businesslike, and then not. She was efficient but kind, knives of competence in a sea of broken water. She checked for a pulse. She called for an ambulance. Samuel's small body trembled as she administered saline. Chief Williams's face crystallized with guilt, an old man holding a new stone. At the hospital, the fluorescent light made promises it could not keep. The doctor, who would not yet commit to a diagnosis, said only that the child's symptoms suggested poisoning and that they needed a toxicology screen, blood for analysis, and urgent monitoring. The word poison cut through the room. Dr. Amina's fingers pressed a hand to her mouth as if to stop it from speaking. Voices rose. Someone demanded to know who had left the glass out. Someone else called the clinic. The men from the clinic were nowhere to be found. Jonathan arrived with a kind of terrible composure that steadied the room. He had spent the night arranging custody paperwork and evidence storage, but at the sight of the stretcher and the small body, his jaw tightened in a way that suggested the quiet was done. He moved through the hospital like a man who had learned law by seeing how people failed to obey it. He listened to witnesses with a thin patience that was all strategy. He organized: sample the glass, take swabs from the dispenser, preserve the bottle lid. He told the police, Detective Eze and a small team, to cordon the mansion, to seize phones, and to reach for CCTV reels. He knew how to turn panic into procedure. The sample would take time to yield results. In the waiting area, Chief Williams sat with his head bowed, hands clasping a wedding ring that had been his for 40 years. He felt its wake like a confession. Mia sat beside him, Samuel's small drawing on her lap, and it was in the silence that the old man's final wish became an active command rather than an idle hope. To see Deborah exposed, to protect his grandson, to stop greed from chewing the family alive. "We should have never read it aloud," he whispered to Mia, thumb tracing the ring's rim. "I thought, if they could only see the papers, they'd know what I meant." Mia took a breath that tasted of hospital air and regret. "You did what you could," she said. "We will do the rest." While Samuel slept under the careful watch of clinicians, Jonathan began to pull threads. He had a network, a lawyer whose hand fit around bureaucracy, a retired police colonel whose pensioned loyalty could be nudged into service, a forensic lab contact in Abuja who owed him a favor from a previous business dispute. He moved in all the places where a man could still pull strings without breaking the law. This was his method, legal pressure, not showy vengeance. He paid for lab priority and forensics to be expedited. He tracked the plastic used in the dispenser to a supplier. He traced a series of burner phone calls to a pay-as-you-go kiosk in Ikeja. He had men sit for hours in nondescript cars outside neighborhood markets where a woman with a jasmine perfume might buy prenatal tea for a worried old man. Evidence, when gathered properly, had its own moral gravity. It could shift a conversation and straighten a spine. Deborah's facade eroded under the pressure like cheap paint. She allowed journalists, who had been softer in the beginning in exchange for access, to approach her with prepared statements about family sorrow. Her words had the hollow echo of someone who polishes a lie for public shining. Emma's posts shifted from velvet sadness to sharp-edged accusations about people with agendas. The comment sections lit up, sides forming like tectonic plates. Amelia's coolness turned sinister in the whispers that began to find ears. A phone picked up background chatter on a conversation in which payment was mentioned. Kenneth retreated to a silence that smelled of counting. Olivia, when she was not asleep in a corner with a needle hidden in her palm, offered stilted explanations about friends from the clinic who recommended the herb for calming nerves. Why would anyone do that, she asked, at a point when her voice could still carry fear. But fear had a way of revealing rather than concealing motive. The clinic that had supposedly sent Dr. Amina's relief was a front. Its registration was in another name. Its phone number belonged to a hedge fund advisory, not a medical facility. Small constellations of proof began to align. A security guard, Samuel's small soldier, now needing replacement, recalled a van parked in the alley the night before, with registration plates partially obscured. The van's tire had left a distinctive smear on the wet clay by the curb, a pattern recognizable to the forensics team. A receipt found in a trash bag outside Deborah's favorite boutique referenced a bulk purchase of white plastic parts, dispenser bottles. The same boutique had been visited by a courier linked to Kenneth's shell company. Jonathan did not shout his progress. His moves were quiet. Letters to prosecutors, an official request for expedited toxicology, a formal call from a senior partner to the commissioner. That commissioner, an efficient man with a reputation for impatience with show, responded to the weight of authenticated paper in ways he would not have responded to mere rumor. Soon, there were warrants drawn with the exactness of legal scripture. Seizure of phones, inventory of household items, a court order to test the water dispenser and to keep the mansion sealed pending results. It was in those sealed days that the family's lines uncoiled. Deborah began to make mistakes under pressure. One private call made to a fixer where her voice showed strain. A hand that fumbled with a button and left a trace on a phone screen. Amelia, who had been hired for precision, left a cigarette ash in a place a woman like Dr. Amina would never have. Olivia, who was unreliable, confessed to an acquaintance that something had to be done, the old man's will, and stopped at the hurried look that told her she had spoken beyond the safety of addiction. Mia watched from the edges of these collapses like someone seeing a slow unthreading. She had expected cruelty. She had not expected the alchemy of evidence to be the kind that felt almost gentle, paper and numbers that could topple a throne. Each piece of proof was a pivot away from the rawness of grief and toward a more organized form of justice. The toxicology return brought the first undeniable word, organophosphate. The lab named the class, the doctors nodded with the expression of people who had seen too much, and the court moved as a city can when commanded by forensic truth. Organophosphates were not typical home remedies. They were the kind of poison that suggested planning, intent, and industry of malicious knowledge. The word made headlines. Emma's followers amplified the outrage with every repost. Deborah announced that she would cooperate fully. Her cooperation was a thin veil. Jonathan knew cooperation could be either a mitigating step or a mask. He moved to secure a witness. That night, the house felt like a place emptied of a particular kind of breath. Samuel's laugh returned, faint and small, and it steadied the lines again. Mia slept in the ward beside him for stretches, converting the sterile chair into a makeshift nest. Chief Williams, released on a doctor's say-so to home care, sat in the parlor with his hands folded, waiting for every phone call that might announce arrests. He had asked weeks earlier, when his motion was merely a wish, that the family name not be sullied beyond recognition. He had asked for truth. What he had not anticipated was how bitter the truth tasted when spat out into daylight. The arrests came quietly in the night. The commissioner's men, advised and supported by Jonathan's contacts and backed by solid affidavits, moved like a surgical team. They took Amelia in a soft knock at her apartment. She did not resist. Deborah was questioned for hours, the conversation recorded, her lawyer present, her expression cyclical between petulance and contrition. Kenneth had fled overnight, but was traced through his offshore account to a guest house in Victoria Island. The police took him as he tried to negotiate a plane ticket. That night, the house felt like a place emptied of a particular kind of breath. Samuel's laugh returned, faint and small, and it steadied the lines again. Mia slept in the ward beside him for stretches, converting the sterile chair into a makeshift nest. Chief Williams, released on a doctor's say-so to home care, sat in the parlor with his hands folded, waiting for every phone call that might announce arrests. He had asked, weeks earlier when his motion was merely a wish, that the family name not be sullied beyond recognition. He had asked for truth. What he had not anticipated was how bitter the truth tasted when spat out into daylight. The arrests came quietly in the night. The commissioner's men, advised and supported by Jonathan's contacts and backed by solid affidavits, moved like a surgical team. They took Amelia in a soft knock at her apartment. She did not resist. Deborah was questioned for hours, the conversation recorded, her lawyer present, her expression cyclical between petulance and contrition. Kenneth had fled overnight, but was traced through his offshore account to a guest house in Victoria Island. The police took him as he tried to negotiate a plane ticket. Olivia, barely coherent, was hauled in under a different set of charges, possession and conspiracy, and offered to speak in exchange for lighter terms. One arrest, though, defied the pattern. The men who had driven the van were nowhere to be found. They had blended into labor markets, changed shirts, and melted into a city that did not remember faces unless it had reason to. Jonathan was not surprised. He had expected this slippage. He had, months ago, placed men in certain neighborhoods to watch for such van movements. They reported a day later. The van had been hired through a chain of men who sold its hire contract 3 times over. The trail was long, but not impossible. When the suspects were brought into the central station, camera lights fixed on faces and the court of public opinion did its work. For Mia, the ordeal of seeing Amelia, so precise, so cold, walk handcuffed across a police compound would have been unbearable if not for the image of Samuel sleeping in hospital, a small life that had not been snuffed out. Chief Williams watched from the sidelines, his chest rocking with shallow breaths, the old man's face lined by both remorse and the thin satisfaction of a man who felt his final hope was being honored. Trial preparation moved like an army. Jonathan worked with prosecutors to ensure the case would not be undone by cheap rhetoric or celebrity lawyers with smoother tongues. He gathered witnesses who were not bought, he line-itemed the receipts, he prepared a narrative that would be airtight: timeline, motive, means. The dispenser was the linchpin. It had been tampered with. Fingerprints that had been smudged were picked up with painstaking care. A smear under the lid matched a store assistant's glove. The link to Deborah's boutique was strengthened by a courier's tracking code that delivered the parts. A taped conversation, inadvertently recorded on a call that had been made to Kenneth, drew a direct line from plan to execution. Still, the city murmured. Emma's social feed pulsed with comments, some calling for mercy, some for scorched punishment. People loved spectacle. They loved being on the side of right when it required less of them than outrage. Mia felt that the court would be stronger than the feeds. She also felt how thin justice could be when it collided with money. The day the indictment was served, the mansion seemed to hold its breath. Jonathan's voice when he spoke to Mia had both steel and apology. "I have also arranged for guardianship arrangements," he said, "legally. Until Samuel is old enough, I will manage the trust for him. The business will be run with oversight. This won't be easy, but I will not let him be sold to vultures." Mia folded her hands in her lap and listened. She had come to understand the particular scald of being thrust into visibility, of having her name turned into a commodity, but there was gratitude there too, practical, clean. Chief Williams placed his hand over hers, fingers wasted with age. The ring he wore had been a weight, but also a pledge. "Keep him safe," he said simply. She would keep him safe. For that promise, she would give her all. The arraignment was a media storm. Cameras stood like a wall of glass and light. Deborah walked as any woman of position would walk, though there was an odd stiffness to her step. Kenneth's tan was gone, the result of nights without sleep. Amelia's jaw was hard, resolute to the last. Olivia slumped in a seat, her eyes wet with the bruise of real regret. The prosecutor read the charges: conspiracy to murder, attempted murder, procurement of illegal substances, tampering with evidence. Each phrase landed like a verdict already in the public mind. Inside the courthouse, a small woman with hands that had once been precise, Mia, took the stand. Her voice shook only once, and then she steadied, because it had to be steadied. She spoke not for herself, but for Samuel, and in that steadiness she became larger than the fear pinning at her. She told the court about the visitors with jasmine perfume, about the glass, about the dispenser she filled nightly and never would again take for granted. She told them about the soldier toy with its missing paint, and how small things become emblems of a life you will not let go of. When the defense tried to paint motives around inheritance disputes, around anger, around the brittle things that families are made of, Mia listened. She had seen the ways people could turn heartbreak into a weapon, and she refused to let them turn her boy into a pawn. Her testimony was a tool. The evidence was the hammer. By the time the judge adjourned, there was an order. Some would be remanded pending trial, others would be bailed under strict conditions. The court did something that those who respected law hoped. It slowed the manic appetite of public spectacle into the methodical pace of judicial process. That pacing, for Mia, was both bread and torture. It delayed closure, but also ensured that victories, when they came, would be rooted in facts rather than fury. Outside the courthouse, Emma's followers debated. Online, the narrative twisted through hashtags and hot takes. The feeds are a crucible where innocence is torched, and reputations either burn or are forged anew. Mia felt none of this as her life shifted toward a quiet order. Samuel snug in a nanny's better schedule. Chief Williams monitored by nurses. Jonathan's lawyers meeting with trustees. At night, after the day's formalities had loosened their hold, Mia sat by the window and watched the city. Lights dotted the shoreline like a scattered constellation. She pressed the small wooden soldier between her fingers and found the nick, the same dent that had told her months ago that small things break and sometimes mend. She thought of the old man's wish, that truth outlast the performance of grief. She had granted a wish not by magic, but by answering the call of a man she had loved in the only way she could, with courage and fidelity. But justice's machinery is long and slow. As the city relaxed into a more cautious breathing, there remained another danger threading through the cases. Those who had not been named, the men paid to do the dirty work, the cell that had yet to be pierced. Jonathan, for all his legal maneuvers, knew the city's underbelly could still bite. He called a meeting in a small office that smelled of coffee and paper. He sat across from Detective Eze and Colonel Obasi, a retired soldier whose loyalty could be bought with truth and a kind of old honor. They plotted, not for revenge, but for sealing gaps. They would deploy surveillance on likely meeting spots, offer deals to those who might want to talk, and monitor bank flows for suspicious transfers that could lead to the van's owners. A few days later, a breakthrough. A courier confessed, under careful questioning, that he had been paid in cash and threatened if he failed. He provided a name, one that smelled of small-time contractors and easy violence. He described a storage unit in Aja where the van had been kept between hires. The raid came at dawn. Soldiers moved in with a quiet that made your blood hush. They opened a unit and found the van, dusty and emptied of its last load. In the back, under loose blankets, they found plastic parts, a label with a batch number that matched the boutique receipt, and a notebook with names that linked to a small network. Names that pointed not to the top, but to those who had been paid to make an old man's body vulnerable. It was the kind of victory that did not end with fireworks. It was a forensic victory, made of paper and plastic, and men who had been tired of being told what to do. The van's driver, when brought inside, collapsed into a confession that spilled the names of those who had financed the operation. A tangle that pulled back toward Deborah and a circle torn tighter around Kenneth. 3 months from the first glass, the city watched as hearings opened, as depositions were read aloud, as evidence confirmed motive. Amelia, who had been hired with a cool, dangerous precision, received a sentence that locked her away in Kirky maximum security. Deborah faced charges that would not simply vanish with public contrition. Her assets were frozen, pending a civil suit that would determine whether the will had been tampered with or whether undue influence had been used. Kenneth was ordered to appear in court for an accounting that would unspool his elaborate shell companies. Mia, watching the slow churning of legal consequence, felt something like relief settle, but it was threaded with sorrow. The old man's final wish had been granted, but not without costs. There were visible costs, reputations stripped bare, relationships ruptured. There were invisible ones, nights of fear, the flattening of the child's laughter into a protective ritual, the suspicion that would forever meet any new friend at the door. In the months after, life settled into a different rhythm. Jonathan took a seat on the trust board, not as a man seizing power, but as someone who had the business sense to steward assets wisely until the child came of age. He also built a security plan that felt less like a fortress and more like a watched garden. Discreet guards, vetted staff, a trust fund with legal guardianship that would prevent any single member from exploiting Samuel for wealth or status. Chief Williams died in the following winter, not in drama, but in a small, private passing where the family came to terms. His death was mourned not merely for loss, but for the closure it provided to a life that had, in its last chapter, tried to do the right thing. At his funeral, Mia stood with Samuel at her side, his small hand in hers. The mansion's chandeliers seemed less oppressive without his presence, as if truth had drained color from surfaces and revealed them for what they were. When the last of the hearings closed and the defendants were sent to the places the law appointed, some to prison, some to years of oversight, Mia took the soldier toy down from a box where she had stored it. Samuel had outgrown it, but he kept it on his shelf like a relic. She placed it on the windowsill, where the light could catch the nick and make it glitter like a small sunrise. One evening, as rain pattered against the glass and the city smelled of wet asphalt and renewal, Jonathan came by with papers, a finalization of the trust, and a simple note that he would remain in advisory capacity until Samuel turned 18. He folded the papers across the coffee table and offered them with the solemnity of a man who had learned a costly lesson about power and responsibility. "You gave him a life," he said quietly, "not the one he might have had, but a better one than he would have had without the choice." Mia's reply was a small, fierce thing. "We saved him," she said, "and he will remember that more than he will remember what he was given." They sat in a silence that was not empty, but full of the residue of battle, of the grit of a city that had witnessed cruelty and still bent toward law. Outside, a child laughed, a neighbor's child chasing a dog, and the sound reached them like a promise. For Mia, that sound had always been the measure of safety. It would be the measure of the work she would do to ensure Samuel's future. Yet, in the quiet after justice, new small complications took shape. Deborah's legal team filed an appeal. Kenneth's partners quietly disputed several frozen accounts. Even as the worst of the danger had been removed, legal skirmishes, those merciless, precise battles, remained. Jonathan assured Mia he would hold the line. "We cannot rest on sentencing," he told her. "We must keep the trust impermeable." Mia nodded. She had come to understand that life after violence is often administrative. Meetings, signatures, forms that both preserve and restrict. It was not the victory of a single gesture, but a long, careful tending. And somewhere, in a low-security wing of the Kirky complex, Amelia sat with her sentence as a new daily truth. She thought of motive in ways that were now small and private. She had not wanted to be caught, but caught she was. In the end, her calm had been an arrogance that a city like Lagos could not tolerate when confronted with paper and persistent law. She had underestimated how easy it is to misplace power when men who wield it choose to do so within rules instead of beyond them. Mia, when she tucked Samuel into bed that night, placed a small coin beside his pillow. A coin from Chief Williams's pocket, smoothed by years of handling. "For when you need to buy courage," she whispered, then turned off the lamp. The child's breath evened out. He slept, and for the first time in a long while, she did not sit awake rehearsing dangers. The city's hummed breeze moved through the curtains like a gentle hand. Outside, the mansion's water dispenser stood where it had always stood, a white cylinder in the kitchen. Mia filled a glass and set it on the counter, then paused and looked at it as if it were an old friend with a secret. She smiled, not without sadness. Some objects keep memory in their shape. She thought of the old man's last wish, and how fragile wishes can be, how they sometimes demand that others become instruments of them. She had been an instrument, yes, but one with agency. She had decided, between fear and action, to act. When she locked the kitchen door that night, she ran her fingers along the glass of the window. In the darkness beyond, the city breathed and turned. There were people whose faces she had never seen, who would never know the small soldier's nick, or why a maid kept a wedding ring in a pocket. There were those who would continue to love or to crave what they did not own. For now, she was content with the small steadiness of home. Samuel's quiet, the trust's slow legal net, Jonathan's watchful loyalty, and a city that still held the possibility of better governance. There would be more hearings, more lawyers, more nights when the infant cry of memory would rise up and demand attention. But the worst of the violence had been turned into something bearable. Accountable steps in a courthouse, a sentence served. Justice, in its imperfect way, had been exercised. Mia closed the curtains and, in the silence that followed, allowed herself a single unguarded breath. The child laughed in sleep, as if he were dreaming of mango trees and birds. She bent to kiss his forehead and felt a warmth that was not all physical, something like relief braided with resolve. She had granted the final wish in the only way she could, by keeping a promise to a dying man and by refusing to be bought or broken. But even as she settled into that fragile peace, a message pulsed on Emma's feed. An edited clip of a private conversation, cut to sound like a confession. It trended before the night had closed. Comments piled like dry leaves. Sometimes a single piece of media could undo careful months of work. Sometimes a rumor could reanimate old hatreds. Mia read the comments with a slow, steady breath and felt the old ache. Justice had not yet finished shaping the landscape. There were people still willing to weaponize memory. Jonathan, watching her face, understood without being told. He rose and walked to the window, placing a hand on the glass. "We are not finished," he said. Mia looked at him, and though she was weary, there was a glint of a resolve that matched his own. "Then we keep going," she answered, "for Samuel." Beyond them, the city continued to breathe, and somewhere in the maze of streets and screens, new plots groped for the light. The mansion would hold its breath for a time, but the world outside would not. Still, Mia had learned how to turn fear into plan. She had learned how to use the law's slow blade. She had learned that a laugh could anchor a life. And she had decided, with the steady courage of someone who has known loss, that she would not let the past swallow her son's future. As dawn threatened the sky, she tucked the soldier back onto the shelf and straightened a picture on the wall. A photograph of Chief Williams smiling in a winter suit, younger and untroubled. Samuel shifted in his sleep and made a sound that was almost a name. Mia watched him, and with the small, terrible certainty that belongs to those who have loved and lost and chosen to protect, whispered to herself, "We will not be undone." The city, hungry for drama, would have more stories to tell. But in the quiet rooms of the mansion, a child's laughter had the last say for tonight. The law had turned its gears. The guilty sat behind barred realities. The innocent would be tended. Still, the web of influence had not been entirely cleansed, and Mia knew vigilance was a kind of duty that could not be abdicated. Outside, lightning traced a path over the bay, and then faded. Inside, the soldier toy cot caught a sliver of light and glinted as if promising tiny wars won. Mia turned off the hall lamp and let the house sleep, but her mind did not. She catalogued next steps in a steady list under her breath. Keep documentation, attend the hearings, maintain the trust, teach Samuel how to laugh without looking over his shoulder. She lay awake for a while, listening to the distant rumble of traffic and to Samuel's even breathing. Justice had been served in part, mercy had been offered in another. The past had been acknowledged. The future would require tending. She felt in that long stretch of night a sorrow that was almost holy. For the first time since Chief Williams's deathbed confession, she allowed herself to hope that the billionaire's final wish, a safer life for his grandson, might be granted not as coincidence, but as consequence of deliberate, lawful action. But the law is porous, and people are not. In the small hours, a new message arrived on Jonathan's phone, encoded in a quiet way that seemed intended to unsettle rather than inform. It was unsigned and brief. "Not finished. Watch the water." He showed it to Mia, their eyes meeting across the dark, and in that instant the thin membrane of peace trembled. Mia turned her face to the ceiling and let out a breath that was for the night, for the little soldier, and for the man who had died believing his final will could be carried out by love. She would sleep when the child was safe and when the courts had finished their work. Until then, she would guard. Outside the mansion, the city slept uneasily, and far off in the distance, a siren, an ordinary sound, rose and fell like a promise that life is complicated and that no victory is ever final. Dawn came thin and gray, folding itself over the bay like a promise that had not yet decided whether to keep. Jonathan dressed in the dark, moving with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned how not to wake a sleeping child. He left a note on the kitchen counter, 2 words, clean and necessary. Be careful. Mia read it and then pocketed her phone as if armor. They did not speak about leaving Samuel. They wrapped him in a blanket and carried him together down the back stairs, past rooms that still smelled faintly of cedar and baby lotion. The house let them go, as if it understood. The doors opened without complaint, the world outside already conducting its small, unremarkable betrayals. The road toward the marina ribboned the city into 2, the familiar side of careful living, and the other, wet and anonymous, where deals and old loyalties changed hands. The marina was less a place than a rumor of boats and salt. Boats bobbed like tired heads. A caretaker, gnarled hands, coffee breath, name tag that said Morris, watched them as if he had been waiting for a particular kind of trouble. He recognized Jonathan by sight, not by name. The city is full of people who remember faces and forget explanations. "You here early," Morris said, when Jonathan asked about overnight guests or strange arrivals. "Mostly fishermen, couple of charter boys. Why? You lost or looking for something?" "Someone sent us a message," Jonathan said. He did not tell the caretaker about the bed at home or the child's sleep. Someone said, "Watch the water." Morris laughed the laugh of people who have learned that everything you fear can be made to sound ridiculous. "Watch the water," he repeated. Then his face went flat. "There's always someone watching the water. It's the water that watches us sometimes. You want locker 12? That's the one people rent when they don't want questions."
Locker 12 sat at the far end of a low dock, metal gray with a paint peel like a bruised moon. The lock had the name of a marina account printed on a tiny, weather-worn tag. A handwritten, half-scrubbed sticker read, "Calder Marine Services." Jonathan's mouth thinned. Calder was a name that had been mentioned in depositions, an intermediary. Not a man of the public eye, but a keeper of small, useful facts. "Did someone rent it last night?" he asked. Morris shrugged. "Paid cash, came after midnight, took a small boat out, came back before dawn, left the locker empty enough to make you think someone had ideas." Jonathan slid the bolt. Inside, amid coils of rope and a spare engine part, was a child's rubber duck, face scuffed and half brown. Someone had stuck a strip of masking tape to its belly. On it, in a handwriting that trembled almost politely, were 3 words, "Not finished yet." Mia felt the breath leave her as if someone had pressed a fist into her ribs. She set Samuel down on the dock between them, wrapped him tighter, and put a finger to his forehead. He murmured, not waking. His smallness made every threat obscene. "Any cameras?" Jonathan asked, because that is what men of law ask first when the world smells of evidence. Morris pointed to an old CCTV mounted under the roof of the bait shop. "Cheap feed, loops now and then. Sometimes things are there, sometimes they're not." Jonathan pulled his phone and began to check the feed with the impatient skill of someone who had learned to trust nothing but time. The footage was grainy and curved, around a blind spot at exactly midnight. The small boat's silhouette, 2 figures, one hunched low, glided across the water like a slow apology. They could make out the outline of a face, a hand lifting the duck. Then the frame stuttered, a single blink of snow, and when it returned, the dock was empty and the boat already near the horizon. "Who else knew Calder had a locker?" Mia asked. Her voice had sharpened into business. Fear had become hunger. Calder, when they found him at a cafe that smelled of diesel and old muffins, was at once apologetic and guarded. He wore the kind of hands someone gets by hauling ropes and pulling nets. He claimed no knowledge of the rubber duck. He said he'd found a small package on his office steps that morning, no name on it, just a strip of tape that said, "Not finished." He admitted to working with a few city officials, no names, ledger entries only. He tipped his hat and said he hoped the Williams thing settled without dragging more people into the mud. Jonathan watched him with the careful attention of someone who knows that people tell the truth in what they forget to say. Calder's eyes were deliberately bland, but when Jonathan asked if he'd ever seen Chief Williams in private company with the city manager, Calder's face tightened, and for a heartbeat he seemed like a man who had swallowed a fishbone and could not cough it out. "The city manager," he said, evasive. "Everyone meets managers. The city is a circle." Back in the car, Jonathan and Mia rode in a bubble of silence that was louder than any debate. The message on Jonathan's phone, the anonymous "Watch the Water," had been sent from an encrypted burner routed through a chain of proxies. The trace ended in a tangle of shell companies and a charity account. The charity? Harbor Lights Initiative. A name that made Jonathan's jaw ache with recognition. The initiative had held fundraiser galas on waterfront piers, had been the site of more than one of Chief Williams's public gestures of generosity, and had been mentioned in a passing rumor about a donation shuffled in strange ways. "Charity accounts," Jonathan muttered. "They make the cleanest messes." Mia's eyes, which had learned to read ledger lines as if they were scripture, went distant. "We need to talk to the prosecutor," she said finally. "If there's money moving, someone with civil subpoena power should follow it." They did not go straight to the DA. The morning was too thin to invite all their enemies at once. Instead, they stopped at the courthouse, where a small knot of reporters had already gathered, and where the scheduled hearings on the Williams estate would begin later that week. Cameras glinted in the sun like inexpensive malice. A producer from one of the networks recognized Jonathan and offered a question about the new leak. He deflected it with the practiced gentleness of someone who had learned to treat cameras as hungry animals. "People will say anything," he said. "We are coordinating with counsel. The courts will speak." That afternoon, when the courtroom took its familiar shape of wood and low light, they met someone they had hoped to see. Detective Harris, the lead on the case that had started with a complaint about missing evidence and had ended in a man confessing at the edge of death. Harris had a map of the city in her head. She had the sort of patience that reads like stubbornness and a stubbornness that reads like love. "We've had similar notes sent to the PD," she told them in a small room where echoes went to die. "Same handwriting on the tape, same delivery method. Not finished. Watch the water. These people like theatrics. They want to be seen, but they're careful not to be found." "Who benefits?" Jonathan asked. "People with exposure," Harris said. "People who know what was in the files Williams kept, and who are afraid the files might reveal more than their reputations. They'd rather unsettle you than be proved wrong." Mia put a hand to Samuel's ear, feeling the rhythm of his breathing. "We need the harbor accounts traced," she said, "and we need to protect Samuel. If this is a threat meant to unsettle us, it will lead to invitations for harm if left unanswered." Harris nodded. "I've already requested extra patrols along the waterfront, but—" she hesitated. "You should know, there's been pressure at the precinct. Phone calls from people who say they are just concerned citizens. Calls that end with, 'We hope you're doing the right thing.'" "From who?" Jonathan asked. Harris's eyes were steady. "From a number that trace routes back to a line associated with the Harbor Lights Initiative." A slow wind pushed itself through the courthouse windows like a hand seeking its reflection. The case that had begun with one man's confession had unfurled into a map of favors and favors forgets. The more they looked, the more the city's glitter showed its undercoat of rust. That evening, after the hearings had closed for the day, a new piece of evidence arrived. An envelope left on the transom of the mansion's service door, where deliveries came and went. Inside, wrapped in wax paper and smelling faintly of brine, was a small brass key and a single photograph. The photograph showed a dock at night, a lighted pier, and a figure, too far to identify, kneeling and placing something into the water. On the back of the photo, scrawled in the same careful hand, was a location: Pier 7, low tide. Mia held the photograph as if it were a thing alive. The key in her palm felt like an accusation. "Why put this?" she asked. "To frighten us? To help us?" "Both," Jonathan said. "Someone is playing a game where they want you to look in the places they pick, maybe to make you miss something else." Samuel slept inside, unaware of keys and photographs. Outside, the city hummed like a thing with its fingers in many pockets. The case that had promised closure at the bedside of a dying man had stretched out like a net, pulling in strange shapes. Mia looked at the water through the parlor windows, where light glinted off the bay like shards of cold glass. The rubber duck, now sitting on the mantel, cast a small, ridiculous shadow. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and then set it down again. It was still only a duck, and yet the duck had the capacity to reshape a life. "We can't let them dictate the terms," she said quietly. "We take the key, we go to Pier 7, we see what the night wants to tell us." Outside, the harbor breathed and licked the shore. Somewhere along the line between charity and commerce, someone had decided the past was not finished.
Mia tucked Samuel a hair tighter into the blanket and, with the steadiness of someone who had learned how to plan against panic, took the brass key, folded the photograph into her pocket, and readied herself to watch the water. The tide would come in with answers or with riddles. Either way, they would be there when it broke. The city, obliging and indifferent, began to change the light. The day had not yet decided which stories it would allow to live.